A man who regarded her as Sandra, a woman deserving of admiration rather than as a celebrity, and she had no choice but to watch him disappear between her fingers like smoke. He had defied time with every sacrifice, restless night, and hushed vow at his bedside. Still, time prevailed. The loss was a scar that Louis and Layla, who had climbed onto his lap for stories and slipped drawings into his hands, were too young to label, but would always bear. A thief no one could stop had torn apart their once whole family of 4. The home that once reverberated with commonplace delights, birthday candles, communal meals, and the silent wonder of belonging, now reverberated with absence. The walls themselves appeared to remember him, and in their silence was the harsh reminder that fate's icy grip can snatch away even the brightest flame. This grief was more intense, unfiltered, and brutal for Sandra, who had suffered betrayal, humiliation, and every storm Hollywood could imagine. It would never make the headlines. It was not consoled by the Oscar on her shelf. She couldn't escape it because of her fame. It was more than just a loss. It was the destruction of the only refuge she had ever created. Even though the ending is written in heartbreak, she still rose in that intolerable silence, bringing with her not only the memory of love, but also the evidence of what it means to love fully. But she was still being tested by fate. Her heart was still raw with grief 9 days after Brian's death when another storm erupted, this time on the global scene rather than in her home. Sandra's Oscar-winning film, The Blind Side, which touched millions with its compassionate message, was abruptly enmeshed in controversy. The man whose story served as the basis for the movie, Michael O'Hare, sued the Twohy family, alleging he had been taken advantage of and misled. Sandra was permanently linked to the movie that had once represented her greatest victory, even though she had no legal involvement in the case. What came next was as unjust as it was cruel. Voices arose in the harsh world of social media with demands rather than sympathy for her loss. Demands that she return her Academy Award, acting as though she was accountable for circumstances that were completely beyond her control. Imagine the cruelty. A woman grieving for the man she had referred to as her partner for 8 years, only to be blindsided by rumors that questioned her integrity rather than her performance. When she was already at her lowest, the same role that had elevated her to the pinnacle of her career was now used as a weapon to injure her. It was a viciously public and intensely personal blow. In one cruel season, the loss of peace and the loss of love clashed. It could have broken someone else. Sandra, however, didn't react with rage, resentment, or show. She decided to keep quiet. Dignity was her choice. After losing all other certainty, she decided to take in Louis and Layla, re-establishing herself as a mother. And that's where her real power really comes through. Not in the golden statue on a shelf or the billion-dollar box office, but in the way she perseveres. She has stood through loss, cared for others through illness, and loved through betrayal. She also endured the storm of a lifetime in 2023. Losing her significant other and facing unjust criticism from society. She was still unbowed and unbroken, though. A woman who responds to cruelty with grace rather than rage. The tale of Sandra Bullock is not just one of wealth or celebrity. It's about fortitude forged in the furnace. It is about the unwavering dignity of a woman who has been tried, wounded, and broken, but still chooses compassion over hopelessness, love over resentment, and silence over spectacle. And for that reason, she continues to be a lighthouse, not only for Hollywood but for all of humanity. Even during the darkest of times, Sandra found herself standing in the aftermath of the 2023 storms, no longer characterized by loss or scandal, but by the quiet strength of a woman who has seen it all. At 61, she bears the grace of survival in addition to the burden of those scars. Living a life influenced more by the haven she has created for her kids than by the limelight of Hollywood. Nowadays, Sandra Bullock spends most of her time away from the constant stare of cameras. Her world revolves around Los Angeles, where she owns a collection of residences valued at almost $39 million, each of which is a haven crafted through decades of bravery and self-control. She once acknowledged that her favorite kind of therapy was watching sunsets through the windows of the Stilt House in Malibu, which has a view of the Pacific. She has leaned into healing at the tree-shrouded, quiet haven in Beverly Hills. Additionally, she frequently takes Louis and Layla to Tybee Island in Georgia, one of her favorite southern getaways to experience the stability of the ocean. When combined, these residences create a map of safe havens from life's storms as well as a real estate empire. Box office successes, Historic negotiations like her deal on Gravity and the streaming era, where Bird Box became a worldwide sensation, have contributed to her estimated $250 million net worth. However, she has frequently stated that her actual wealth is found in spending regular mornings with my children, cooking pancakes, and simply being there, rather than in having millions of dollars. She has decided to take a back seat in her career. Sandra declared she would take a hiatus from acting to concentrate on motherhood and recovery, following the hectic events of the Lost City in 2022. As promised, she has mostly disappeared from red carpets and sets. She continues to produce through Fortis Films and would be welcomed back in Hollywood in a heartbeat. Her most significant role, however, is currently off-screen. She once remarked, "The one thing I want to be is present for them." She referred to them as Louis and Layla, the kids she protects with the same zeal she once gave to her work. Nevertheless, her presence persists even when she is retreating. Hollywood will never forget the woman who redefined the rom-com and the action thriller simultaneously, who carried gravity on her shoulders, and who transformed rejection into resiliency. Even though she doesn't attend every award show, her impact lasts like the lingering glow of an unquenchable fire. The shadows are still there. The loss of Brian Randall will always be a wound. He was once called the love of my life, the best thing ever by Sandra. Now those words reverberate with tragic finality. According to friends, she keeps his pictures close by and feels his absence during her day's quiet moments. He is still mentioned by Louis and Layla as a part of the family's history. Sandra bears the responsibility of leading them forward, while also privately lamenting the love she lost too soon. She must strike a careful balance between honoring her own heartbreak and preserving her children's innocence. However, she has made a dignified choice in striking this balance. Sandra Bullock is a living example of survival at the age of 61. Even though it now bears the scars of nights spent crying and laughing, her beauty is still radiant. Her renownedly straightforward skincare regimen and discipline, which includes Pilates, kickboxing, cycling, and even weekend dance sessions, maintain her health, demonstrating that resilience is not only spiritual, but also physical. Although she rarely makes public appearances, when she does, her admirers are awed by her brilliance. Not because she is in pain, but rather because she has handled it gracefully. Today, Sandra's story is not about never-ending projects or continuous visibility. It's about what's left over after the lights go out. A woman who chooses love despite having experienced betrayal, break-ins, illness, loss, and the harshness of judgment. A mother who prioritizes her children over her career, accolades, and everything else. A survivor who has demonstrated to the world that strength is steady, silent, and unbreakable rather than loud. Her Oscar will never fade. Her movies will never be forgotten. The evidence that dignity can endure destruction, however, may be her greatest legacy. Sandra Bullock serves as a reminder that resilience is a way of life, a flame that endures despite attempts by storms to extinguish it. We are thus reminded of the silent strength of resiliency as we reflect on the remarkable woman's journey, which was filled with victories, wounds, and unwavering grace. In addition to being a famous person we saw on screen, Sandra Bullock is a survivor who still lives her life with honor and compassion. As a tribute to Sandra Bullock, a star, a survivor, and most importantly, a mother whose strength continues to inspire the world, remember to hit like before we leave. The passage still conveys Sandra Bullock's intense emotional journey, but it now flows more smoothly and logically. Sandra Bullock appeared to have already weathered the most brutal storms life could bring. She had rebuilt herself as a single mother, endured betrayal in the most intense spotlight, and dedicated her strength to protecting her son from suffering. But she was still being tested by fate. Because sometimes the scariest moments don't occur in courtroom whispers or in front of flashing cameras. They arrive in the middle of the night when everyone thinks you're safe. June 8, 2014. After a long day, Sandra was exhausted when she got home in Los Angeles. Louis was spending the night safely with his nanny. The house was quiet, the quiet that usually heralds tranquility. Then that silence broke at 1 a.m. A sound, distant at first, then nearer. She assumed it was coming from the gym. Then it moved. Her chest grew constricted. There was a person inside. She locked the bedroom door by herself, ran into her closet, and with shaking hands, dialed 911. She spoke in a whisper over the phone, trembling with the realization that she had lost her home and that her safety had been taken away. Every second seemed to drag on forever. There was more than just an intruder behind that door. It was the harsh reality that terror can still infiltrate through barriers like gates and walls. They caught the man. A stranger named Joshua Corbett had been following her around for days, leaving notes and keeping an eye on her from the shadows. Clippings of her face and a letter that muddled obsession and delusion were in his bag. He had several guns. That night he had nothing with him, but the terror he left behind was his real weapon. Because they resided in her nervous system, the scars were invisible. Suddenly panic would set in. Something as basic as gazing out a car window caused tears. She acknowledged that she fell apart, her body repeatedly reliving the evening, not her own fear, but the thought that Louis might also experience it, that her son would inherit tremors not inscribed in blood but in silence, was what haunted her the most. In order to restore her peace, not only for herself but also for the young boy who deserved to grow up without any shadows, she turned to EMDR therapy, piece by piece. Sandra Bullock had weathered the storms in Hollywood. She was now surviving mental storms, and in her struggle she revealed a truth more eerie than any part she had ever performed. That while the bravest people are those who struggle to heal, even the brightest stars are susceptible to evil. Sandra Bullock raised Louis, whom she had adopted in 2010, with a quiet dignity for years after her divorce, providing him with the safety she had once craved, and protecting him from the chaos of celebrity. However, despite being surrounded by the purest form of love, there was still a void that could only be filled by genuine companionship. When photographer Brian Randall entered her house in 2015 to take pictures of Louis's 5th birthday celebration, that all changed. The world's favorite American sweetheart, Sandra, met someone who didn't see the movie star, the Oscar winner, or the box office victor. He just saw her. What started out as a professional hire soon developed into something neither of them had anticipated, a connection that seemed to have been there the entire time. And as their relationship deepened, Sandra quickly opened her heart once more, this time with Brian at her side. She took in Illa, a courageous foster child who had already been through more than any child should later in 2015. Former model-turned-photographer Brian brought the wisdom of fatherhood with him. His own daughter brought patience, tenderness, and an innate awareness of the obligations of love. He soon transcended being Sandra's partner. For Louis and Illa, he took on the role of a father figure, a dependable figure who complemented her devotion with his own warmth. For the kids, he was more than just mom's friend. He was the entertaining parent who brought humor and affection to everyday situations. Sandra and Brian never got married, but that didn't lessen the depth of their commitment. When their friends saw them together, they spoke of a calmness that softened even her sharpest edges, a peace they had never seen in her before. Sandra had finally found her harbor after years of loneliness, betrayal, and nights of questioning whether love had truly left her. There was an unstageable joy in their home. Laughter erupts from the car windows as school runs. Long after the kids had gone to bed, there were late-night conversations in the kitchen, birthday candles flickering in the cozy embrace of family. This ordinariness felt extraordinary to a woman who had lived for decades under the harshest Hollywood spotlight. It was the dream of a whole, loving, and unfailingly real family that she had once feared would never materialize. Imagine how cruel life can be just when a woman dares to think she has finally found her safe haven. It is nearly intolerable. After years of rebuilding, loneliness, and betrayal, Sandra Bullock suffered a blow in 2020 that no amount of film could ever heal. The man her children called their anchor, Brian Randall, who had transformed her house into a home, was diagnosed with ALS, a disease so cruel that it robbed him of his strength piece by piece, leaving his body betraying him and his spirit burning. They agreed to keep quiet together. Sandra would later tell a select group of people, "We didn't want the kids' joy poisoned by a countdown." It was love, not shame, that gave rise to secrecy. Birthday balloons, not whispered discussions about decline, were what Louis and Illa deserved. Sandra then took a silent step back from the outside world. Red carpets and premieres are over. She transformed her stage into a kitchen where she prepared his favorite dishes. In the early hours, she would whisper consolation by the bedside. A house was converted into a care sanctuary where nurses adapted to the routine of the family. At the time, the world hardly saw her. Just brief glimpses, whispers from paparazzi, flickers. But behind the scenes, Sandra was playing the most difficult role of her life. Not as a beloved actress, but as a caregiver who wouldn't leave her beloved man to deal with his illness alone. She mastered the rhythm of machines, how to calm him during the long nights when he refused to sleep, and how to spoon-feed him with a patience that comes from devotion. In order for Louis and Ela to remember their father not for the illness but for the love that surrounded him until the very end, she kept the house warm by playing the music he loved and sustaining laughter. She held on to pieces of him, the way his eyes softened when Ela placed a handcrafted drawing in his hand, the way his smile curled when Louis joked, the hushed thank yous that took all of his strength but meant the world. She would later remember, every little moment felt like gold dust. And it was true that she had supported him during his darkest moments, not with hopelessness, but with a love so intense that even the most mundane act seemed eternal. Then on August 5th, 2023, the unimaginable happened with a brutality no heart could fathom. After 3 years of being gradually deprived of movement and then speech by ALS, a disease that left only his eyes to speak for him when his body could no longer, Brian Randall, who was only 57 years old, still so young and still so needed, passed away. Silence fell like a crushing weight that no one could lift, but Sandra was there holding his hand, her kids pressed close. No scripts, no cameras, and no cheers. Inside 4 walls, only the ragged sound of grief. The void that seemed to swallow the air itself had replaced the man who had brought laughter into their home. It was unimaginable devastation for Sandra. The love she believed life had denied her was finally hers. The emotional impact of Sandra Bullock's journey is felt while preserving readability thanks to this updated version, which flows more naturally and is simpler to follow. However, Sandra paid the price in public because Hollywood has a way of testing every crown. When she returned for the Keanu Reeves-less sequel Speed 2, Cruise Control, she saw audiences reject it and critics tearing it apart. The storyline faltered, the budget increased, and Sandra, who was now the movie's face, was pulled down with it. Later, she joked, "I think only 5 people like that movie," laughing at the recollection. She had only agreed to do it in order to have the opportunity to make Hope Floats, a movie she firmly believed in. So beneath the humor was the sting of humiliation. Sandra's method was to risk failure, even mockery, in order to have the opportunity to tell stories that were important, and she was rewarded for her perseverance. She clutched the Oscar for The Blind Side as she stood on the Academy Award stage after years of climbing, falling, and climbing again. The world knew that she had fiercely, compassionately embodied Leanne Tuohy. Private heartbreak surrounded what should have been a moment of pure triumph, the pinnacle of a career. Beneath the smile, Sandra's marriage to Jesse James was crumbling due to betrayal. The greatest professional honor and the lowest personal destruction were separated by 10 days. But even in that storm, she used the same strength that had gotten her through each rejection to protect Louis, her newly adopted son, from the mayhem. The Oscar honored a woman who refused to let pain define her, not just a performance. Then came the movie Gravity, which left both critics and viewers in a state of shock. Sandra, who spent the majority of the film alone on screen, bore the burden of an entire universe, and viewers rewarded her with a box office haul of more than $700 million. The movie broke ceilings in addition to breaking records. Sandra demonstrated that the outsider, who was once made fun of for her accent and odd attire, had developed into a skilled negotiator who could manipulate the system to her advantage by landing one of the most lucrative deals in Hollywood history. And yet she continued to change. Sandra didn't back down when streaming changed Hollywood. She won, as millions of people watched her battle to save children in a world gone blind. Bird Box became a worldwide sensation and sparked a cultural moment. Decades after Speed, The Lost City demonstrated her ability to still command the box office, while The Unforgivable exposed a darker, raw side. Her DNA was the same throughout every stage of her career: brave decisions, resilience forged through adversity, and an unwavering refusal to be contained. Her ascent was never solely based on praise. It was about regaining dignity, regaining power, and maintaining faith. The same young woman who shivered in a cold New York apartment, scrubbed tables at night, and pushed coffee and instant noodles into dinner in order to pursue a dream. But one day, that frail waitress who survived on pennies would sit across from studio executives and set her own terms. $20 million paychecks, tens of millions more in profit shares, and a real estate portfolio that now stretches from coast to coast. There is more to Sandra Bullock's journey than just a career path. It is a living anthem. Evidence that success is not bestowed upon you in times of ease, but rather is forged into existence during nights of famine, rejection, and unrelenting labor. Her journey from obscurity to one of the most bankable stars on Earth, from ramen to riches, serves as a reminder that even the coldest winter can be transformed into a crown of victory by the fire of perseverance. However, the darkest shadows are often cast by Hollywood's brightest spotlights. Sandra was about to discover just how easily success can devolve into tragedy. She thought she had finally found the missing piece to her life when she and Jesse James walked down the aisle in a sunlit ceremony in Santa Barbara, just 5 years prior, in July 2005. They merged their worlds for years, hers as a Hollywood star, his as a father and builder, and Sandra devoted herself to the goal of having a full family. As they prepared to welcome a child into the home they were creating with such hope, they even started the adoption process together. Early in 2010, everything appeared to be coming together: career, family, and love. Every wound was meant to heal during this season. Sandra Bullock stood under the Academy Awards lights on March 7, 2010, having clawed her way from ramen dinners in a frozen New York apartment to box office glory over the course of decades. The golden statue for The Blind Side, in which she played a woman who gave a child a home by opening her heart, was in her hands. The applause roared. Cameras flashed. She was crowned by the world as evidence that greatness could still be defined by courage and compassion. She was more than just America's sweetheart for a brief time. Its lifeblood was her. In 10 days, however, the fairy tale was shattered. The same headlines that had hailed her victory now became ruthless, revealing her husband's adultery and shattering their marriage. Sandra wasn't the one who spoke. Rather, it was the tabloids who forced her private suffering into the spotlight by revealing intimate betrayal on every front page. What ought to have been the most impenetrable period of her life turned into a public trial of faith. Once a crown of happiness, the Oscar in her hand now pulsed like a harsh reminder of heartache. Behind the glittering dress and rehearsed smile was not Hollywood's golden girl, but a woman who had been blindsided by life's harsh turns rather than a screenplay or work of fiction. However, there was a secret that the world was unaware of within that storm. Sandra had entered her home a few weeks prior in January 2010, holding a 3-month-old New Orleans boy. She gave him the name Louis. He was supposed to be accepted into a whole family, 2 parents, 1 house, and finally a stable future in her heart. On Oscar night, she even slipped his little green socks into her clutch, which was a secret charm of the new life she was subtly creating. When her own world felt stable, she dreamed of bringing him into the world. But before that dream could materialize, it was torn apart. She was signing divorce papers with one hand while rocking her infant to sleep with the other, rather than enjoying the joys of motherhood next to a husband. It was cruelly ironic. The woman who was praised for portraying a mother who provided a home for a child was compelled to become a single mother right after her own house fell apart, with flashbulbs exploding outside her gates in the quiet of midnight feedings. Sandra had to face the harshest reality. The family she had longed to provide for her son had already been destroyed before it had even started. Paparazzi stationed like vultures at her gates. Betrayal splashed across every headline. The echoes of applause still ringing as silence closed in. It is heartbreaking to imagine the weight she carried. Nevertheless, she declined to respond to suffering with resentment. There were only public outbursts and camera-staged retaliation, just a woman who opted for dignity, silence, and her son. She later asked herself, how do you process grief and not hurt your child in the process? Philosophy wasn't that. It was a matter of survival. She created a cocoon of love around Louis during those nights of whispered lullabies, teaching him that love could triumph over loss by denying him a taste of her anguish. Her greatest triumph, not the Oscar, the red carpet, or the international headlines, was found in that decision. It was the silent victory of a mother who transformed destruction into devotion. The world witnessed a scandal. Sandra experienced rebirth. A performance was honored by Hollywood. A mother was honored by life. The unshakable grace of a woman who carried both glory and grief in the same 10 days and chose love, not betrayal, as the author of her next chapter, is her true crown, not the golden statue that sits on a shelf. And if there was ever a more tragic event than her heartbreak, it was that a man had allowed a woman whose grace was more valuable than gold to elude him. A living example of what it means to rise, fall, and then rise again, Sandra Bullock is more than just a celebrity. Viewers recall Annie Porter's valiant efforts to survive on that speeding bus. They recall Lee Antuohi's unwavering love and her willingness to take in a needy boy. She is more than just an actress. She is a loving mother, a producer who molded her own career, and a strong woman who has persevered through betrayals, terrifying nights, and losses that would shatter anyone. Red carpets all over the world were once illuminated by her smile. Her presence brought grace and warmth to the screen. Her name came to represent sincerity and tenacity. In addition to being an artist, Sandra Bullock is a representation of tenacity, unwavering dignity, and a flame forged in storms. She has transformed personal suffering into enduring art for over 30 years, standing between tragedy and triumph. At age 61, we enter that fiery symphony of life to confront the most destructive storm. Remember to hit like before we start as a way to honor this incredible talent. It is devastating to understand that the initial rifts in her life were caused by the unadulterated grief of a young girl who never felt like she belonged, not by poverty or peril. Even as the world continued to move beneath her feet, a sense of loneliness lingered. Sandra Annette Bullock was born in Arlington, Virginia, on July 26, 1964. Her parents were John Bullock, an American vocal coach and soldier who proudly and disciplinedly served his country, and Helga Meyer, a German opera singer whose voice could fill opulent European halls. Her days were characterized from the start by the weight of expectation rather than carefree play. Backstage in Europe, surrounded by costumes and music, learning to follow rigid rehearsal schedules while other kids ran around freely outside. She was already performing Mozart and Bizet under stage lights at the age of 5. Her delicate voice compelled to blend into children's choirs. By the time she was 10 years old, she had lived in more cities in Germany and Austria than the majority of her American classmates would ever see. Every move had forced her to part ways with friends and confront the heartbreaking reality that she had nowhere to call home or even just be a kid. When the family returned to the United States in 1976, the concealed pain intensified. Her German clothing was ridiculed by her classmates. She drew mockery for her accent, which stuck to every word, not with her, but at her. Laughter reverberated through the corridors. Years of silent humiliation that left deep scars of loneliness replaced what should have been the joy of belonging. Later, she would think about how being by herself on the room's edge had taught her to see the other faces that had been forgotten, and to feel the suffering that no one else had. This empathy turned into her life's and her art's hidden compass. English continued to be the language of survival and German the language of solace. She was torn between two identities, never completely one or the other. Her life appeared to be a split screen, with America on one side and Germany on the other, and a young girl trapped in the shadows of both, silenced by sadness. But she was not destroyed by those wounds. They became stronger and more resilient. Empathy pressed into loneliness. Adaptability transformed instability. When it burned on screen, rejection turned into authenticity, the very quality that Hollywood could never create. One day, the young girl who once hushed her voice to conceal her differences would use it to rule the world. And with nothing more than bravery, skill, and grace, the outsider, who was ridiculed for not fitting in, would develop into a woman who brought millions of people a sense of recognition. Sandra Bullock was not poor as a child. Music, discipline, and the orderly world of two stable parents influenced her early years. However, everything changed in 1986 when she left East Carolina University, only a few credits away from earning a degree in drama. She had the option to stay, graduate, and stay safe. Sandra, however, desired New York, the stage, the dream, the unattainable opportunity. The cost of that choice was devastating. A young woman without a well-known name, strong connections, or safety net faced harsh treatment from the city. Overnight, the daughter of an opera singer and a voice coach went unnoticed. She was broke, anonymous, and struggling to survive in a cruel world. She trudged home with blistered feet and empty pockets after working nights as a waitress, coat checker, and bartender. In the dead of winter, she collapsed into a small apartment without heat. Her body ran on fatigue and sheer willpower, and dinner was far too frequently nothing more than instant noodles and bitter coffee. She refused to rely on her family, not because they couldn't assist. She desired to demonstrate her ability to make a name for herself in the harsh world of entertainment. As she would later remember, I learned more from the no's than I ever did from the yeses, a confession born out of nights spent practicing in the dark while whispering lines to herself while the city slept. She received very little recognition in the late 1980s. Movies such as Who Shot Picango, Religion, Inkers, and Hangman came and went without any impact. No one took notice. No one gave a damn. The posters were faded. Dust accumulated on the reels. Sandra, however, carried them with her like scars. Every one of them served as a reminder of how brittle dreams can be. But she wouldn't give up. Each rejection served as fuel. She became more determined with each silence. She acknowledged that she was hungry as a result of those failures. An ache so intense that it kept her upright when others would have fallen. Demolition Man followed in 1993. Although it wasn't the lead, she was eventually included in the picture because she acted with Sylvester Stallone and Wesley Snipes. Lightning ignited a year after a spark was struck. She never had Speed 1994 written for her. Halle Berry was destined for the role of Annie Porter, which even made its way around the desks of the biggest names in Hollywood. Even though Sandra wasn't on the list, she was honest, vulnerable, and completely real when she showed up for the audition with just a folding chair and a paper plate for a steering wheel. There was no denying the explosive chemistry with Keanu Reeves. It had an electric charge. The studio was unable to turn away. Her life was completely changed when Speed exploded at the box office. Making $350 million worldwide on a relatively low budget, Hollywood's new star was the same young woman who used to live off of ramen and scrub tables. She accomplished the impossible once more in 1995 with While You Were Sleeping. Mastering comedy with the same poise that she had applied to action, Sandra Bullock transformed rejection into resiliency, obscurity into stardom, and the adversity she chose for herself into the very fire that forged an extraordinary career. In less than 10 years, she went from being a waitress in New York with blistered hands to becoming America's sweetheart. Her story demonstrates that success is never determined by where you start, but rather by how much you are prepared to put up with for your beliefs. Sandra Bullock didn't just show up in Hollywood. She dominated it, going from a cold New York apartment eating ramen noodles to becoming a box office success. But power followed, not just fame. Sandra quietly established her own production company, Fortis Films, a statement that she would not be a passenger in her own career, while the world was still referring to her as America's sweetheart. She started forming the stories she thought were important after landing a daring studio deal. In addition to packing theaters, Hope Float's, Miss Congeniality, and 2 Weeks' Notice bore her imprint as both star and producer. As evidence that her vision could transcend the big screen and into American living rooms, she even extended her influence into television by producing the popular sitcom George Lopez,